Every 2 minutes, someone is sexually violated in the United States. Rape, we're told, is not about sex, it's about power. That power reveals itself through force that is visibly apparent and physical. But that same power, that same force, can also be unseen, coercive, and psychological. The story about this invisible power is a story we don't expect to hear. Convicted sex predator and former pastor Brian Williams of the Sunbury Grace Brethren Church twice raped and sexually assaulted 15-year-old Jessica Simpkins. He admitted to his horrific crimes in this deposition.
You entered a written plea of guilty to 2 felony counts of sexual battery, one for the oral intercourse and one for the vaginal intercourse.
He was sentenced to 2 4-year consecutive terms in prison.
And for that, you were sentenced to 2 consecutive 4-year terms, which you're currently serving out here at Chillicothe Correctional. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In this insider exclusive Justice in America Network TV special, our news team visits with John Fitch, founder of the Fitch Law Firm in Columbus, Ohio, his client Jessica Simpkins, to go behind the headlines to see how John successfully won a $3.67 million verdict for Jessica, $3.5 million of which was intended to compensate her for depression, PTSD, and other pain and suffering that she experienced as a result of the rapes. There was just one big problem. In Ohio, by law, non-economic damages which compensate for things such as disability, disfigurement, and trauma are capped in most cases at $250,000. These caps are a central tenet of the tort reform movement. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The second greatest trick may be the insurance industry's success in getting more than half the states to implement tort reform. But as more and more victims of sexual assault are taking their cases to the civil justice system, the caps are having unforeseen consequences. Basically, if you rape a child, you get the benefit of tort reform. Tort reform makes it financially impractical for children like Jessica to hold those responsible and accountable in the Ohio legal system. Jessica's case was appealed all the way up to the Ohio State Supreme Court, which held that capping damages awarded in a civil lawsuit to a teenage victim of sexual assault did not violate the girl's constitutional rights. Here's Jessica Simpkins to tell how unfair the Ohio tort reform laws are that protect sexual predators and not their victims.
I was raped twice by my pastor, Brian Williams, when I was 15 years old. And the way it affected me is I feel like I felt so small. For a couple of days there, I kept going back thinking like, did this actually really happen to me? The second thing that was the toughest thing for me to do was talk to my dad about it. To see the hurt in his eyes was probably the worst thing for me to do. After I told my dad about it, I couldn't ask for a better dad. He was there for me, comforting, no matter what I needed. Every single court hearing, every single deposition I went through. After it all came to light and, people started finding out, I didn't really talk to very many of my friends about it. The ones I did talk to were very supportive. 90% of the people thought that it was my fault, blamed me. What I want Ohioans to see is that this tort reform is protecting the predators. No amount of money will ever make it go away, will ever make it better. And my life's just changed and I'll never get that life back again. I really wish I could. While you have the victims whose lives are changed forever, I don't think my life will ever go back to how it was.
This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Columbus, Ohio. It is my great pleasure to introduce John Fitch to the show. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you.
Tell our audience a little bit about your firm. What type of law do you practice?
Our work involves a broad range of cases within the field of personal injury. We only represent people that are injured or families of people who've been killed in accidents.
Today we are here on a case that got a lot of notoriety here in the state of Ohio, and it is the case that involved Jessica Simpkins. Tell our audience who Jessica is, please.
Jessica Simpkins, at the time of the incident that we're here to talk about, was 15 years old. She was a sophomore in high school, and she was raped twice by her pastor, Brian Williams. This occurred in 2008, and this happened at the church.
And when you represented her at that time, you were well aware that in the state of Ohio, we're going to talk about this a little later, there were caps. Explain to our audience what that means in terms of if you get a verdict, what that means in terms of your client.
So in 2005, there was a large push by the insurance industry and big business in the state of Ohio to pass what is known as, or what is called, tort reform.
And the purpose of tort reform is supposedly, from their perspective, what?
Well, they allege that there's too many frivolous lawsuits and that jurors make this so-called subjective decision about how people are compensated. In this particular case, we're talking about what lay people call pain and suffering. So they put limits or caps on the amount of money that a jury could award. In Ohio, that included even children who are victims of sexual abuse, including rape. So in Ohio, what we have is a law that protects those who rape or otherwise abuse children, or their enablers, in this case, and limits the rights of the child.
Brian Williams, who was Jessica's pastor, was convicted, or he agreed to a plea, correct? To be sentenced to 4 consecutive terms in prison, correct? And he is, I think it's a level 3 sex offender now, correct?
I believe that.
Which is the highest level of sex offender in this state. Is he currently out of prison, by the way?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay.
I think
So
he was released a couple of years ago.
Yeah, he has to register as a sex offender, etc. Okay, with a conviction, which is normally a plaintiff lawyer's ideal situation, because you've already got somebody who has admitted to what they did, civil suits are often filed for the type of case that happened here. In this suit, you ended up getting, I think, a $3.7 million verdict, $3.5 million of which was for pain and suffering, including the stress that she went through, the PTSD, etc. How does the jury arrive at that number, by the way?
Well, I think the jury considers a number of factors. Obviously here, this is a very traumatic experience for Jessica. So in her case, we retained a forensic psychologist who talked about all the problems that arose from this. Her father also testified, and of course she testified about all of the issues that arose from this abuse.
You have this $3.7 million verdict. What happens next?
Under Ohio law, the jury is not permitted to know about these caps. So they make their decision, and then in this case it was the church, not Williams. Williams was no longer a defendant in the case. It was the church, and frankly their insurer, that filed a motion to reduce the award.
What were those previous incidents that were brought to the attention of the church that they chose to ignore?
So there was an incident that occurred somewhere in the early or mid-90s that involved a girl that was somewhere between 13 and 16 years old, as best we could determine. She was at a concert. This is a church-sponsored trip that had gone out west. Brian Williams was a youth pastor. They were at a concert, and she alleged that Williams, without her consent, began to rub her back. He was immediately behind her, and he worked his hands skin on skin down her back. She became frightened as his hands moved lower and lower, jumped up and ran away. She had a little friend, a male friend, that was on the trip, who actually testified at the trial. And his testimony was that she, the victim, had told him at the time that Williams had tried to stick his hand down her pants. So that was the first incident, and that was brought to the attention of the church. And her mother, who was also a witness at the trial and a very important witness, had confronted the church and the pastor, the head pastor of the church. And she testified that the head pastor said, "Let's keep this quiet to protect our brother." And she was very angry about that. And she recounted that story years later. So that was the first incident. There was another incident involving counseling, if you want to call it that, of an 18-year-old woman named Robin Wexel. And Robin Wexel testified that while in this counseling session, Williams had said a number of things to her that were pretty bizarre and were of a sexual nature, to include the statement that I could fuck you right now here in my office if I wanted to, but I'm not going to do that. So those were the two incidents that was also brought to the attention of the then acting head pastor, but once again was not brought to the attention of the elder board or any authorities.
What were your challenges to the state law?
We did not challenge the entire tort reform statute. We only ask that the court consider the statute to be unconstitutional on a limited basis, and that is for children that are sexually abused. There is an exception to the caps in Ohio. There's actually a few exceptions. But those exceptions are generally categorized by lawyers as the so-called catastrophic injury exception. And that can include the loss of a bodily organ. That can include a substantial and physical permanent deformity of the body. And what we argued to the court was the rape of a child is analogous to these catastrophic physical injuries. And the court should declare it unconstitutional on that limited basis, because even though it does not involve a physical injury to the extent that the body is deformed, such as a bad scar of the face, it is nonetheless so traumatic to the child that it is in the nature of a catastrophic injury, something the child will live with for life. And so that was the essence of our argument before the Supreme Court.
And it fell on deaf ears.
Well, it was a 3-2 decision. and 3 justices voted to uphold the statute and did not accept our argument, and then 2 justices dissented.
Final outcome of the case?
Once that decision came down, the parties engaged in a mediation, and eventually the case was resolved roughly 9 years after the incident took place. If I may, since we're talking about tort reform, I'd like to make this point. It was never the law in Ohio that jurors could award whatever number they wanted to award without review of the courts. The courts always had the power to analyze what the jury did. And if the trial judge felt that the verdict was excessive for whatever reason, he always had the power to reduce the verdict. And if the defendant was unhappy at the trial court level, they always had the power to go to the Court of Appeals. So you have a second level of review of the jury's action. And in Ohio, if that's unsuccessful, then you have the right to ask, it may not be granted, but you have the right to ask the Ohio Supreme Court a third potential level of review of the jury's actions. So we always had this checks and balances within the system, if you will, so that any individual case could be reviewed by the courts for an excessive verdict. But that's taken away, and the trial court's power in that regard is taken away with the so-called tort reform.
Excellent point, because it basically says tort reform was unnecessary because the checks and balances, as you said, were there already.
What happens here is we put people in a box. You may have 1,000 or 10 different thousand scenarios. You can sprain your back or your neck, and you're in the same box in most regards as a child who is viciously and brutally raped.
Today we are fortunate to have Jessica with us, so let's bring her on right now. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jessica Simpkins to the show. Welcome to the show, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell our audience a little bit about what your life was before you met Brian Williams.
Before I met Brian Williams, I was a normal teenager, happy. You know, if I wanted to go hang out with friends, I would go hang out with my friends. Never second guessed really anything. Never really got into trouble. Played basketball my whole life. Just a happy, normal teenager.
You trusted a lot of people.
Yes, I was very trusting of people. I had no reason at that point in my life to not trust somebody.
Take us back to the 2 sexual assaults by Brian Williams against you. What were your thoughts immediately after that? What did you feel?
I personally felt disgusted, wondering what I had done wrong for this to happen to me. Really, my thought process was I wasn't sure what to do, because the very last thing he told me before I left the office was, don't tell anybody, it takes 2 to tango, you'll get in trouble too. I'm a 15-year-old kid. I honestly thought I would get in trouble. I didn't want to say anything to anybody. Fortunately enough, I had a very good friend who knew something was wrong, asked me about what happened, and I had let her know I had gone over to see Brian for counseling that day.
This is after the event happened.
Yes. But that day I had gone over for a counseling session. My grades were kind of going down. So I had scheduled a counseling session with him after school. And when I had gone in there, he automatically asked me, he goes, well, are your grades falling because you're sneaking out and having sex with guys? And I was like, no, threw me off guard. I had no idea where this was coming from. And that's when he came out from behind his desk and placed his hand on my shoulder and asked me to suck his dick.
The first person you told was a friend, correct? What did that friend do?
So it was actually that same night that it happened. She told me to get to school early the next day and to not shower. So I did that. I got to school early. I didn't put my clothes in the laundry. I didn't take a shower. We got to school and she was like, well, you have to tell somebody. So we told our gym teacher, who then in turn went to the principal and the authorities at the school.
And what happened after that?
They came and got me out of class and...
The school authority?
Yes, the principal, the dean of students, guidance counselor came and got me from class, asked me what had happened. And at that point, they did call the Sunbury Police Department and my dad to come up to the school. We ended up having to go to the police station to file the report.
What was your dad's first reaction?
He was mad. Asking me, when he got to the school, he was asking me what happened. Yeah. And I'm embarrassed. It's my dad. I don't want to go into detail with my dad. And I told him I really don't want to talk about it.
Now, this happened twice, did it not?
Events had happened beforehand. And I should have known better than to go over for a counseling session. Yeah. But I guess I was naive at the time.
Yeah. How did your life change after that?
After I couldn't trust anybody, even my closest friends, like as far as telling them anything, I didn't trust my dad for a while, which was the worst because my dad's my best friend. I tell him everything. I was afraid to go outside at night, afraid to go out and hang out with friends. Didn't know who was watching me at this point because up until then, I never thought something bad could happen to me. And then the one place that you would think that nothing should happen, it did. So I second guessed everything.
What were your feelings then after you saw he had pled guilty?
I felt like he didn't get enough time. I mean, the thing he did changed my life forever. In 8 years, I just feel like it's not enough for him to know he did something wrong, and I feel like it should have been longer.
You're 28 years old right now, right?
Yes.
So this is 12 years later. You're on national TV right now.
Yes.
So what do you have to say to people like Brian Williams? That's one.
One thing I'd like to say is it definitely comes down to thinking before you do something. You can change somebody's life. I mean, for him, it's, he wanted a pleasure, but you're changing somebody's life that's never going to be able to get that back. As hard as the victim will try to get their old life back, to feel like their old self. I mean, it's 12, 13 years later now, and I still don't feel like myself.
Do you trust people more today?
A little bit. Definitely when it comes to people I do not know, I don't affiliate. I back myself away. I find my group of friends and I stick with that group of friends.
What does justice mean to you?
To me, it's along the lines that you do something wrong, for the crime you commit, you need a good punishment, so to say. If you change somebody's life forever, I feel like your life should change forever, meaning he should have been sentenced to life.
A jury of your peers came back and awarded you $3.7 million, $3.5 million for pain and suffering, what you went through. Even today, we're looking at 12, 13 years later. Mm-hmm. You still have effects from what happened to you when you were 15 years old.
Yes.
They are the ones, the jury of your peers, that came up and awarded you this amount of money for your pain and suffering. Yes. The Ohio State Supreme Court, under the current Ohio tort reform laws, took it away basically, all but $250,000. What do you think about that?
Honestly, it does hurt for there to be a law in place to basically tell you, your life's not affected by the event just because, I can live a life, I can hold a job and have friends, yeah, and I didn't lose a body limb. But for somebody to say, you couldn't have been affected that much, I mean, it hurts, honestly.
One last question. What's your opinion of John Fitch and the job that he did for you?
John is a great person. He was there every step of the way. 15 years old, you go to court and they're using all these big terms you don't know. John's very good at simplifying it, speaking to you in layman's terms, so to say, so that you understand. He made sure to call every step of the way, let me know what was going on, gave me advice on what to do from there, gave me my options to think about. Definitely, if anything were to come about in the future, I'd always go back to John.
I want to thank you for being on this show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Because of this case and another one, a recent decision that you had a verdict for $134 million for young people who were brutalized, sexually attacked. You've become very well known in the state of Ohio. A lot of people must call you up wanting you to take on their cases. How do you end up choosing the cases that you do?
Well, it's very difficult, in all honesty, to do these cases in the state of Ohio. With a cap of $250,000. And of course, children, they're not wage earners. So in addition to the so-called pain and suffering and the caps we have there, you're permitted by law to ask for wage loss if you have it because of a, the incident, and medical bills. And typically medical bills are not terribly high. And of course, there's no wage loss. So when you have these kind of caps, it's very difficult to take on these cases. The cap actually includes, when we're talking about so-called compensatory damages cap, it actually includes the legal expenses and the attorney fees. So you go through this process, and it's really very difficult to actually do something for your client. So you have to look at the cases very carefully, and there have to be some really unique circumstances before it makes sense to actually represent someone, even though they're completely innocent, and they may otherwise have, a completely legitimate case.
I want to thank you very much for being on the show. Congratulations on making this point to the Ohio State Supreme Court and the people of Ohio, because this has to change. This is the unintended consequences of tort reform. Children are being hurt.
Well, with all due respect, I've heard that point before about how it's unintended. After Jessica's case, a bill was introduced in the legislature to change this. It went nowhere. It got one committee hearing. A couple years later, there was another attempt in the legislature. Same result. It went nowhere. So when people tell me this is the unintended consequence, I don't accept that. This is the law. It's well known that we have this issue with respect to the so-called tort reform, and our legislature has twice rejected the idea that we should change the law.
Well, it needs to change, and I want to thank you for being on the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.